Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me...
Thomas Brooks is back. Hope everyone's doing well.
I'd say I'm doing all right.
Just all right.
Stuck at home.
Yeah,
trying
as
to,
one does.
Yeah, trying to figure out who I am in this post-COVID or concurrent.
Are we even post-COVID
Gonna
yet?
say concurrent COVID world, and that I guess kind of gets us into what we're talking about today. Trying to figure out who we are, how we define ourselves. Someone who has been teaching for, I think I'm going to start my 10th year at the time of this recording, getting ready for this fall 2020. That's teaching in front of a class, shifting to online, how I feel about that, and how some of my much older colleagues feel about that in terms of their sense of self as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of moves us to chapter 3, the self, and really how the self is influenced by our thoughts, feelings, and environment. And so with this, I want to try to, open up with a story and try to find stuff that's just extreme enough to get your reaction. And so there's this recent, I follow a blog called Retraction Watch, and they talk about science retractions and controversies within the community. And there's this recent controversy that's come up where hundreds have called for a petition to retract a paper that they call unscholarly, overtly racist, and full of racially violent narratives.
Oh, Lord.
And this was published in a higher tier kind of social sciences, not necessarily psychology, but a journal called Society. And it's written by a very prominent researcher and Professor Lawrence Mead, who's at New York University. He's a public policy researcher. And he's actually one of the big influential figures when it comes to things like welfare reform, work requirements, and things like that. That's where he's sort of gotten his name. But he wrote in this essay that that basically he argues that racism and a lack of good jobs do not explain why America, the world's richest country, continues to have a problem with poverty. More plausible, Mead states, and this is a direct quote from his article. I don't want to take anyone out of context.
Good job.
The United States has an individualist culture derived from Europe where most people seek to achieve personal goals. Racial minorities, Mead says, because I also don't want to confuse this with anything that I would say, however, all come from non-Western cultures where most people seek to adjust to outside conditions rather than seeking change. Another difference is that Westerners are moralistic about social order, demanding that behavior respect universal principles, while in the non-West, norms are less rigid and depend mostly on the expectations of others. So
I'm triggered.
We haven't gotten to conformity yet, but the definition of a norm is a socially defined rule that is in fact determined by the basis of others. I'll just add that in there for a psychology perspective on some of this. He says that these differences best explain why minorities, especially predominantly non-white, especially Black and Hispanic minorities, typically respond only weekly to chances, and not like bi-weekly, like weekly as in week, to chances to get ahead through education and work, and also why crime and other social problems run high in low-income areas. Basically, what he's saying is it's the fact that they're not adapting to white culture. At least that's how people are interpreting this.
Ew.
That if they would just be individualist enough, if they would just, for lack of a better term to describe it, pick themselves up by their bootstraps.
Yeah.
Which is a physical impossibility, to literally pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But if they would pick themselves up by their bootstraps and engage in more self-empowered individualism, rugged American individualism, which I'll come back to in chapter 6, as a conforming pressure, that they would do better. And I think, again, this kind of taps into this debate that we often find ourselves in when we're talking about social influences on the self, is that a lot of these pressures are invisible, that we're not aware of advertising's effect. I mean, I wasn't aware that advertising effects, after last episode, affected my love for bacon and eggs.
Right. Yeah.
And I wasn't even alive when that happened. That was done to influence societal norms that then influenced what I grew up eating, or what my dad decided to eat, my grandfather decided to eat. And that because we don't sort of know all of the pressures, we're kind of left to our own minds. We're left to our own cognitive understanding of the self. And again, if we go back to other things like attribution theory and this sort of viewing the individual versus the situation, because we don't know the situation that the person's in, it's much easier to say, well, no, there's not this systematic problem that's affecting these entire groups of people. It's them. It's something about the person, because when I look at myself, I don't see as well a lot of these systematic pressures that are influencing what I agree with, what I disagree with. I see me, the individual.
And I think also part of that is that we also view our worldviews and our things that we ascribe to other people are also a product of our own experiences too. And so, like, as white people, we don't necessarily have the life history or experiences that would lead us to even assume that there were some systematic influences on our lives that directly and very explicitly affected us in ways that it affects other people in the country. And so, we also have to approach these issues too from the lens that, like, oh, people aren't necessarily being as I don't know, not abstract enough, but like taking the extra step to recognize that other people have different lived experiences as them.
Yeah, this kind of gets us into this little bit in the previous chapter, but with the idea of the schema, or where we kind of apply it into our own lens of the world with what we call a construal, that we have these individual construals, the way we kind of construe and perceive and understand our environments. And that it's important to know that everyone has their own individual unique construal, and that ours may not be, it may be our reality, and it may match pretty well to what is reality from our point of view, but we're only in, kind of one location in one state in one city, wherever it may be, that these other perceptions and other realities, essentially exist to other people's lived experience. And what this creates is essentially the beginning of how we develop our self schema, that we have these mental shortcuts about everything. What is an apple? What is a dog? What words, what concepts do you associate with all of these things? We can also do the same thing with ourselves. We kind of put ourselves in the center, and what's the first thing you think of when you think of yourself? How do you define, label, identify yourself?
Well, I'm a Virgo.
I actually just recorded a lecture where I was talking about pseudoscience, and I talked about astrology and said, well, you don't have to believe me because I'm a Gemini. And then like two or three sentences later, I said, I'm actually not. Or am I? The world may never know.
What a Gemini thing to say.
Or is it? I could be an Aries. I could be something else. But yeah, this way that we view ourselves, and I like bringing up, as much as I don't bring up William James a whole lot, William James, talked a little bit about this in terms of the self, and argued that we are all constructed of kind of these two halves, the known and the knower. And so the known aspect is the me. It's about me. It's autobiographical to an extent. It's tied to things like self-knowledge. And then there's the I, the knower, and it's kind of our ability to be self-aware. It's our understanding of ourself, not just in the now, but also our ability, almost maybe a little metacognitive, our ability to know stuff about ourselves and to kind of be able to construct and sift through that knowledge. And so one of the things that I think of when I'm thinking of this kind of me and the I, takes us to so that this chapter in particular is split into three parts: the cognitive self, the feeling self, and the social self. And so the basics in understanding, so whether or not we're making this argument that Dr. Mead here, Lawrence Mead, is making concerning, is it just that the person is not individualist enough? There's something about their personality trait. This was a very similar argument that was made in psychology, I don't know, 50 years ago when we were arguing that things like locus of control, that certain minority communities had a very external versus internal locus of control, and thus couldn't take responsibility for their own action. And what the counter argument by people like Tajfel and social psychologists were, no, I mean, maybe they have an external locus or a higher external locus of control because they're in an environment in which they do not have control.
Right.
In which the system or some, these pressures are impeding their ability. And that there's an argument to be made that, anyone in those systems or prey to these forces that may make it harder for them to have a job, or if you find yourself in the middle of a recession and you can't find work, and you just kind of want to give up because it's really no fault of your own. You're a hard worker. You're willing to go out there and do the work. But you don't have maybe the ability to find that your understanding of yourself, your kind of known aspect is very different than yourself in that situation. And it may cause this sense of going, well, it's not me. There are these pressures that are keeping me from doing that.
Right. It's kind of like the idea that, kind of going back to what he was talking about, how like minority groups are allegedly less politically active or less likely to take control and autonomous. But if you're in a situation where you're working like, I don't know, 2 or 3 essential worker jobs, like those jobs are very literally dictatorships, in the sense that you don't really have a lot of control over your schedule. You don't have control over the tasks you do. You don't have control over how much you get paid. And then at the end of the day, when you're done working all of your hours, you've just left a context where you've had no control whatsoever, and you're exhausted, and you probably have kids to take care of. You've got homework for the community college that you're a part of right now. Like, it's no wonder people are not politically engaged. Except for right now when nobody has a job.
Right. And surprisingly, right now is a perfect way to see how, when some of those, for lack of a better word, shackles are unbound, when people have more time to pay attention, have more time to focus on things that they may find important, suddenly they become more active at things like that. I can argue that I was talking to a graduate class once about the topic of politics comes up, and so like, in part we're almost privileged in our ability to be able to sit here and talk about this because we have the time to pay attention to the news and to read headlines and to pore over what's currently going on in the political sphere. It's a lot of people don't. And that has, drastic social influences for their understanding of themselves, and also as a way of how that shapes more of what we'll talk about in the next chapter with attitudes, how that shapes some of their attitudes and perceptions, and understanding of what they like and dislike, who they like and dislike.
Hmm. That's one of the things that drew me to social psychology in the first place, like not just like any branch of psychology, is that it's kind of my responsibility to be in the know of what's happening politically and historically and culturally, because that affects everything that we do as social psychologists. Like if you're one step out of line with the times, your study is not going to make any sense to your participants or to the reviewers.
And it can be hard too, because even though, even with that, like needing to get that information, it's part of an issue too when we go to some of these communities that we do research with, that we're suddenly out of the loop because like we can only keep up with so much.
Hmm.
And aspects of their self-knowledge and their group knowledge is very different than even what we might. And that's part of why it takes time and energy, like we talked last time, energy and effort and work to
Hmm.
be able to kind of engage in some of this. And if it's not maybe a part of your job, um,
Yeah, like a cognitive psychologist, for example, doesn't necessarily have to worry about historic effects with their research because the memory, attention, metacognition, that's pretty stable across contexts. But, like, for example, I have the study that I ran a couple years ago about kind of how people approach hygiene and cleanliness with their sexuality and sexual behavior. If I were to run that again this next semester, I'm going to get wildly different results, I imagine.
oh yeah, yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
and any little thing in the environment
Yeah.
can change that.
Well, let's just introduce a pandemic and mess up your data.
So, and this kind of gets us into the idea of, how these topics resonate with us, and how, even if it's something like a political event or a protest or whatever it may be, that one of the ways that you can kind of think about how we think about ourselves is to kind of plot out. There are ways to set up what are called schema charts. You put yourself in the middle, and then you start branching off everything that you think of when you think of yourself. So I might think of father, psychologist, um,
Teacher,
scientist, teacher, um,
Gemini.
fan, Gemini, which will be a complete lie because I'm not a Gemini, or am I?
Oh, are you?
We don't know. Um, so that too, that if there's something in that chart, you kind of make a bubble chart, branches, and then you branch those branches, and then you branch the branches. Um, that when something kind of contradicts, this starts to lead into feelings about ourselves. So we want to feel in much of the same way that we want to feel good about the groups that we belong to, and
Hmm.
our general decisions in life. We like to feel good, and that's sort of one of the standard tenets of social psychology, that people in general like to feel good, and
Hmm.
we will
We'll
sometimes
do anything to maintain that.
go to very great lengths. And so, if someone were to say to you, Black Lives Matter, or respond all lives matter, or say trans rights are human rights, how you respond to that in part is determined by, at least partially, by that self schema, and by
Hmm.
your lived experience, your understanding of what those words mean. And again, what those words might mean to you might mean something very different to someone else, especially if they're consuming different media, if they're
Hmm.
perceiving certain aspects of the groups involved differently. And
If they're
um
members of the group.
yeah, I was having a conversation when a lot of the protests started with a good friend of mine from back home, and he's got a pretty broad police family, and he started talking, and I was like, maybe we should talk about something else. I'm not quite sure where you're going with this. And he really surprised me. I mean, his argument, especially looking at like an intense brutality, and kind of stepping over the line, was something that he viewed as a problem within the this was with his brother and father, being in the police force.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, oh, like that's kind of like, okay, so like my perception and understanding of, someone who's so closely tied might be more defensive of some of like the kind of very overt videoed
Mm-hmm.
actions that were being populated around at the very beginning of the protests that are still populating Twitter and whatnot. And it was just sort of very interesting for me because, again, like his understanding of self was also, and I don't want to speak for him, but also maybe look at this in terms of he views maybe his own connection. He didn't join the force, so he might have a detachment there
Mm-hmm.
for one, but aspects of his self-esteem and kind of move into the feeling self maybe aren't as threatened because or maybe are more threatened by the videos of police acting out against protesters, because he might view that as saying like, this is not who I see my brother as, this is not who I see my father as, these are
Mm-hmm.
this is not maybe the type of officer that they have portrayed to me as
Mm-hmm.
who an officer should be.
It, and also it might be a little bit of, if you've integrated something, like let's branch it to something that we can speak to, which is teaching. If you're gonna ask somebody, if you're gonna look for someone who's gonna have the strongest opinion about poor teaching, you're gonna ask a teacher, or how a
Yeah.
school system is messed up, or how a university doesn't serve its students well, or how it doesn't take care of its faculty. Like, the teacher's going to be the first one to tell you. They're not going to immediately jump to the defense
they
of the
they they
system.
they may not be as open in the classroom, but if you get them by themselves,
Mm-hmm.
they will not stop talking.
Right. So it's kind of also this, in order to have the self-esteem, you have to, balance this is the idealized version of my identity, or the system in which my identity operates, but also have full awareness of where that contradiction exists, because you have to personally grapple with it.
Yeah, and it's again tied back into kind of how we think about ourselves, because how I view myself as a teacher, and what I view as maybe acceptable or unacceptable behavior in a classroom, what a teacher should do versus shouldn't do, how lenient, how open, how caring, um, how much effort I should put into each student. And then that can vary.
Mm-hmm.
They can vary greatly. I mean, I've had some not so good teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think of a nice word, but I've also had some really great, compassionate, understanding teachers, and I try to remind myself I'm not too detached from student life, or at least
Mm-hmm.
from the other side of the classroom, and to think, but again, like part of that is tied in. So when I do something that might go against, or when I'm confronted with a situation that might challenge some aspect, or when I see another teacher, engaging in some behavior that I think is maybe crossing the line. There was a rule at the last university I worked at that we couldn't penalize for attendance, because we had some professors who were saying, you missed 3 days, I don't care why I'm failing you for my class.
Right.
And it got to the provost, and they basically said, no, you guys can't do this. So we just have to make a rule that no one can do it. No one, and so I was like, okay. I mean, it doesn't change a whole lot for, I understand people are going to miss class, but,
Mm-hmm.
but also
That's why
like,
we have podcasts.
yeah. and yeah. And so how that affects me. And if there is something that comes up where I do something, or someone says something, usually I get, someone wants to denounce teachers,
Mm-hmm.
might rile me up a little bit, because it's affecting that aspect of a core aspect of my identity, much in the same way that a statement or a slogan, or another group might be perceived as challenging one of those kind of core aspects of someone's self-identity, which in turn kind of threatens that self-esteem. It kind of begins to create the conflict that we'll get into further with things like, group conflict and prejudice. But it's sort of the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of that is a perceived hit, to one's self-esteem. It's that there's that famous quote that, what is it, to those accustomed to privilege, um
Oh, equality feels like oppression.
Yes. And that, if you're accustomed to maybe not having to worry too much about politics, someone
Mm-hmm.
talking about politics can be really upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
Like that student who wrote that really bad review I got in the fall of 2016 that I talked too much about politics in a social psychology class.
It's a
the,
social psychology class. What did you expect we were going to talk about?
in the fall of 2016. I'll never let it go because it affected my self-esteem as someone who
Right.
views these social aspects as so core, that it was definitely something that I was like, wait, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to stop
Mm-hmm.
talking about this stuff because it's important. I'll try to be is balanced, but if we're talking about conforming pressures or identity threat, and there's a really good example currently going on in the news because some member of some political party started mouthing off. I'm going to want to talk about that because it's a salient way to get into explaining how these processes, or at least showing how these processes play out in real time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess this kind of gets us into these threats to self-esteem, and one of the things that you wanted to talk about is
Yeah.
how
Terror
we deal with
management
some of
theory.
this.
Yes, terror management theory. So the basic premise of this theory is that humans are set apart from all other animals, not because we're a social species, but because we're a cultural species. And so culture is a product of our ability to A, have a sense of self, and B, be able to project our sense of self into the future and realize that one day we're going to die. And that is a very uncomfortable, terrifying bit of knowledge that you have an expiration date. And so, one of the things that, well, the major thing that we do in order to not just constantly live an existential crisis is that we develop cultures. And cultures provide us with two things. Usually, first, it's a narrative. So, let's say with our teaching, for example, that could be a cultural narrative that, teaching is valuable, teaching is important to, push the human race forward, teaching, has a long history. There's, many famous people who were teachers or were taught by famous teachers, etc. And so you kind of get a sense of universality or a sense of the infinite with a teaching culture. And then the second thing terror management theory does is it allows us to place ourselves within that narrative and be active participants in it. So if you go into teaching and you live in a teaching culture, not only do you have a sense of immortality, but also you have an active role in that cultural narrative. So very similar to, say, religion. You have a infinite narrative of creation of the world up to the afterlife, and then you have specific guidelines or norms or expectations to live by in order to participate in that narrative and achieve immortality. I guess the teacher parallel there for immortality would be that you teach a famous person that brings your ideas into the future, or you publish your book.
So something like, I could even take it in a simpler note that if I tell my students, my only goal is that you at least walk away with one bit of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I try to keep a low bar.
I think by low bar is that I want to be like an option on somebody's intro to psych multiple choice exam. Like, I don't have to be the answer. I just,
just an option.
Just an option. Like, I want to be E.
But the idea behind that is that even if that person, so long after you're gone, if that person says, oh, hey, I know about this concept, and that was, Professor Brooks or Professor Chadbourne who taught me that, we essentially live on through that knowledge. We are immortal through that knowledge.
Right. And so the idea with terror management theory is that if you attack the culture that somebody is a part of, then you are indirectly attacking their self-esteem. So when we talk about this cognitive self and the associations with the self, usually you're going to have cultural aspects that are tied to it. So American, Christian, teacher, Virgo. And so you get on, YouTube and you're like 10 reasons why Virgos suck. You are going to feel personally attacked because that's connecting with a bit of your self-identity.
And so you
And
create a video that says 10 things why Sagittariuses suck.
Right, exactly.
To feel better about yourself.
Ooh, yeah, I think we're going to move into that a little bit later. And so in order to compensate for that, typically we double down into whatever cultural narratives that we're already a part of. And so you could, going back to our police brutality example, with the Blue Lives Matter movement or counter movement, I guess, you attack that cultural icon, people feel personally attacked, and then they double down into the reaction that is in line with that cultural narrative that they've placed themselves within. So you see this, I think one of the earliest works was looking at judges in America, and they had half the judges fill out a questionnaire and respond to a prompt that made them scared of their own death or something. And then the other half didn't. And then they presented them with a case study. It was like, hey, this prostitute was caught on the street. What's the fine going to be? And so they hypothesized that if you're scared of your death or if your culture is being attacked, then you're going to double down into that conservative American ideology and raise the fine for the offender, which is what they found. And I think the average fine was like hundreds of dollars more than the group that didn't have the threat attached to it. And so this is also why we see things like, one of the things I bring up to my class when I'm teaching death and dying is that the British monarchy has fewer press scandals during war. They have the most support from the public during war.
Because a sense of order is we want this leader, this figure, and you could argue the same in terms of things culture. Like probably presidential popularity.
Yeah, no, if you want to not
though we did see a spike, though it kind of didn't play out with Bush. And I don't know.
Re-win election. He did re-win.
But that was after 9/11. As the war continued on his popularity tanked by the end of his second term. He was pretty well disliked. I mean, I think there's a kind of forgetting period because of current events, as we've kind of forgotten some of the things during the Bush administration. It'd be kind of interesting though.
That's kind of why I'm very interested in where this 2020 election is going to go, because terror management theory would posit that Trump would get reelected, because we are currently living under very real knowledge that we're all going to die one day.
But it can also be a flip side, is that maybe the counter to that is wanting some level of security. And when you have a lot of opposing voices, including from the president himself, saying like, this is a hoax, this is going to go away, and then it's not, or there's a lot of conflicting stories about real issues and how plans, or a lack of a plan, has been on the kind of the federal level, where a lot of state level plans are going through. Federal level's been lacking. And I mean, I don't think it's controversial. I mean, I guess it is controversial now for me to say that. It shouldn't be that controversial. But maybe that could be part of it too, is that part of that could also come from, one, the denial of it could be explained by terror management, of completely denying that there is a pandemic affecting us, or that masks will help you. Because if you think that they will, then you have to agree that things are bad.
Right. And that interrupts our cultural worldview, which means we have to accept the terror.
Yeah. And then so you could see a flip side of that if you have individuals who feel that an alternative would bring more stability. And that stability is ultimately what's going to help us reduce terror, as it were.
Right. And so I guess it kind of depends on the side of the cultural equation you're on, which is kind of why we see this doubling down of partisanship or an us versus them happening, because the terror is affecting one group in a way that they're like, oh, we got to get this guy out and regain power so that way we can relieve our terror. And then the other group's like, we can't acknowledge the terror because our cult, we have to rely on our cultural view that he is right. And if the other group takes over, then we have to accept our terror.
And probably the most interesting are going to be sort of the people caught in between. So you look at people like the Lincoln Project or the Never Trump Republicans, who are in this kind of really weird place, I guess, for them, because on one hand they're like, we're gonna support Joe Biden, and on the other hand, that they're like, but this was our group, like this is a group that we belong to. I mean, there's definitely, just the self-esteem psychology that has to be going on behind the scenes and within the minds of some of the people working in these groups. And
I mean, I think the best place to be, at least psychologically right now, would be in the vote blue no matter who camp, or the Make America Great Again camp. Because if you're like the left of the Democrats right now, that's a whole level of trauma. And the libertarians are not doing great right now either. So
kind of caught in the middle of the kind of partisanship. I mean, which again, and we'll get into, I guess, some of the social perception or social perception aspects of this, is that part of that is, also shapes the level of perceived partisanship that exists. And I mean, there definitely is partisanship, but also, like, sometimes we have to take a step back and go, is it as bad as Twitter is making it seem? I follow some news about like what the House and the Senate are debating on, and
it seems pretty bad.
Maybe we've gone that far. I'd be really
life
interested
is imitating Twitter now.
But it kind of gets us into these, these aspects of identity and labeling, and I'm kind of getting a little ahead of where we want to be, but that aspects of these labels, it'd be really interesting, and I think this is something I'll put a pin in, and we'll come back to when we talk about group identity and group conflict, is that it'd be really interesting to see where the numbers are now. So during the Obama administration, they did a bunch of research looking at political views, and what they found is where there was this idea that both the left and the right were just shifting further and further, what they actually found is that people on kind of the far left, standard left, center, that whole side was pretty stable, and they were seeing a further and further shift to the right. But it'd be interesting, especially with like the rise in popularity of Bernie Sanders, with a lot of the stuff that's been going on for the last 4 years. Are we seeing more? And again, I'd have to see where the data lies. Like, are these trends continuing to just kind of is that expansion one-sided like it was 8 years ago?
Yeah, I would expect, just
or is it
hypothesizing, I would expect that the left is moving further left right now. My Facebook feed has not been happy that the DNC did not include Medicare for All in their party platform this week. And I was like, ooh, my centrist Democrats are going to start getting nervous.
But again, if we're thinking about this in terms of like our own self-esteem and terror management theory, this is sort of a prominent time where maybe people who didn't care or didn't think about things like healthcare as a prominent aspect of something that they had to be concerned about are now
very aware,
very hyper aware of,
especially all the people that lost their jobs in healthcare over the last couple months.
Yeah. And so, and I guess this kind of takes us into, the other aspect of the feeling self is that part of how we maintain certain aspects of this self-esteem, and possibly even manage certain aspects of terror, especially if we're looking at ourselves through a cultural lens, comes with how we compare ourselves to others. And so a core aspect of how the feeling self enacts is through social information from our environment, from other people, and then we put ourself against their information. And this leads us essentially to either what are typically termed things like upward or downward social comparisons. So upward comparisons, where we compare ourselves to people above us, status wise, on any whatever category we're looking at. So maybe if I'm
Right.
looking, at my teaching ability, I look at someone like a tenured professor, someone who's got far more experience, or someone who's prominently talking about like pedagogy and teaching, and kind of compare myself to them. In this
Right.
case, it's upward, and that can be really helpful, because normally we do these upward comparisons as where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I might compare what we're doing right now, and a podcast that's might get more views when we make our students listen to it, or when we
Right.
offer our students the ability to listen to it. Um,
Right. Yeah,
you know,
no, this
but it can also be a hit to my self-esteem. It's very intimidating to try something like this, or to start streaming, or to start putting yourself out there when there are people who are arguably better talking about any of these topics on their own than we will ever be. Because there'll always be someone better. There'll always be someone we
yes.
can compare ourselves to. And then the flip
Yes.
side is downward social comparison, where we pick someone worse than us.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't always the healthiest
No.
comparison,
And we'll
because
talk more about that later.
it can mean degrading others. It can mean putting others down. I like to say that if you want to do this healthily, try to compare yourself to your past self,
Yeah.
because in a lot of cases you're better than you were 10 years ago. I know
Mm-hmm.
I was. I like to think of myself a lot in comparison to high school me. High school me was nowhere near where I'm at now.
Cringe.
Yes. And yeah, I look back and I'm like, oh, like I did that, or I was interested in that. I thought back the other day of myself actually like ragging on my brother, my younger brother, when it came to his music choice. And I look
Oh.
back and I just go like, I was a music snob at some point. Like that is like the least thing that I would care about now is
Right.
what music you listen to. But it was something that kind of I used to boost myself up, because I listened to real music at
Better
the time,
music.
better music at the time.
You were a
And
connoisseur.
yeah, I guess. And I can look back on myself and go, no, not really. Um, but also to ignore, aspects of maybe music that I listened to that wasn't as good. Uh,
Right.
but kind of how we utilize this information, but also how the social system kind of influences or forces, in some cases, some of these upward and downward comparisons on us,
Mm-hmm.
and
Oh
that
yeah. We
can
get
further shape our view.
if we just look at kind of the hierarchy of like higher education, for example, like I look at when I was an undergrad, I was constantly comparing myself to seniors and freshmen as I was moving through those 4 years. And then when I got closer to the end, I started comparing myself to grad students and freshmen. And then now that I'm a grad student, I compare myself to faculty and freshmen.
And then when you
And
become a faculty member, it's tenured faculty versus like the lecturers, and then
right.
the adjuncts. And then when you get tenure, you're probably comparing yourself to other tenured professors with more prestige or university level.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think of I don't know what the appropriate comparison might be where I'm currently at, but when I went to my undergraduate at the University of New Orleans, and so if you're familiar with anything about Louisiana, the only school that matters is LSU.
Oh.
The only school that matters. And when I said I was going to go to UNO, because it was close, I was told it was a commuter school. When I taught when I was a graduate student at Southeastern Louisiana University, I got privy to a conversation that was had where someone on the board called Southeastern the Iron Curtain on the interstate, keeping more students from going to LSU. And I was like, who would say that? But again, it was this kind of comparison about not where you were academically in your school, but what school you went to, even though
Hmm.
these were all state institutions. But we used to get that a lot. And then, so there was this upward comparison that would hit my self-esteem because I went to UNO. But then every spring, we would have a slew of LSU parking tags in our parking lots of the
Mm-hmm.
students who decided they couldn't go to LSU anymore, so they came to UNO because they thought it would be easier. And I was like, see, we're not that bad. And so there was some downward social comparison that kind of played out in there. But also, a way to kind of deal with that, like, oh, did I pick the right school?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's the school my parents want me to go to? Things like
I
that.
When I was going to community college, one of my biggest comparison issues was like whether or not I should have gone straight to university instead of going to community college first. And the whole first year, fall, spring, I was like, I don't know. Like, is this quality education? Am I going to be all right? And then summer hit, and I took my two biology courses back to back in the summer, and the whole class was filled with Texas A&M students who had failed out of their biology courses over the semester, and I was beating them in grades and class participation, etc. And I was like, oh, I'm totally fine.
And
It's all
again, yeah,
good.
and a lot of this comparison in part is kind of manufactured by this sort of structures of
Mm-hmm.
saying, like, this is why our school's better than the community college, or this is why you have to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who in part relies on their job regarding university enrollment, I would be a big proponent for things like trade schools and other options, because
Mm-hmm.
I knew people who, like, going to get a degree in whatever field you might pick just may not have been the best option for them, especially 4 years later and tens of thousands of dollars in debt.
Right.
That they could have been fine, or they probably would have been just as happy. But again, that's kind of person to person, and that again says it's a whole nother conversation to be had about telling people that they need to figure their lives out at 17 or 18. They need to know what they're going to do.
Right. No, my suggestion is always going to be go to community college, see if this is even your thing. Like, spend your late teens, early 20s figuring that out, and then commit to the big bucks.
Yeah, and that's another good example of that kind of upward downward comparison. We see people that we went to school with. We see other people who have made it successful because they went to college. Or the flip side is we're like, hey, look, Bill Gates made it, or this insert famous person who dropped out of college here made it. Maybe I don't need this, and then again, how we compare ourselves, or how we change aspects of our self view based on these examples, these kind of prototypes or exemplar figures within our world.
My high school nemesis just got her tenure track job at Texas Tech.
I don't think I have a high school nemesis.
Mm. we constantly competed in 4-H. We were from different counties.
Yeah, I was kind of out of all that.
Yeah, no, she texts me. She's like, I got my tenure track job at Texas Tech. And I'm like, congrats, I'm having an existential crisis.
But I mean, I eventually went back, and I mean, I trying to think of like what our age difference is. I think it's almost 10 years
between you and I.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Might be a little bit less.
But that was part of me with a master's degree teaching, like, oh, I can't do this anymore. I need some stability. I need to find a tenure track job somewhere. But yeah, it was aspects of in part people in my environment, and kind of looking at and comparing myself to other people, to my peers, or to my superiors in terms of the academic hierarchy. And going, I want to be there. I want to be at that higher level. So what this brings me to, and kind of like we'll move on to like labels and kind of how those work, and into moving into the social self, because we've been kind of alluding to it. I do want to bring up the bias of the week.
Ooh, the bias of the week.
So I've gone through, and I'm trying to pick relevant biases, and this relates exactly to what we're talking about. The bias of the week is social comparison bias.
Oh, how appropriate.
And so this isn't really about making biased social comparisons, which is kind of what I thought it was when you read the
Mm-hmm.
title. You're like, oh, this is because we make more, downward social comparisons or something. So this is Garcia, Song, and Tesser, 2010, and they kind of coined this process that it's the tendency to make recommendations that prevent others from surpassing you in relevant areas in which you have high standards or
Oh
high status.
no.
So it's a bias that, like, let's say you get a grad student and that grad student's really promising. And so you tell them, no, don't publish in that journal.
Publish in this journal. It'll be easier to get into.
That sounds a little familiar. Or maybe you shouldn't apply to a job at that university. Or, maybe a book isn't feasible.
I kind of wonder, like, there's a saying, and whenever like you're applying, that you always end up at a school that's one tier lower than the school that you graduated from.
Huh.
I wonder if that has to do with this bias.
I mean, partially it could be that.
Well, the reason why that is perpetuated.
Yeah, I mean, possibly if someone's making the suggestions for you. I mean, I could say from my personal experience, I applied at every open position that was available to me. So I wasn't really afraid to apply to that position at Yale. I didn't think I had that big of a shot, just because competition's definitely better than where I am.
Well, Yale missed out on an excellent Brony research team.
I would agree. I mean, there's great fan research, and I'm at a place now that's willing to give me a grant to research fan communities. And so, yeah, I'm perfectly happy with that. But yeah, there may be something there, especially if someone's making recommendations for you. I also know that there are biases concerning, what school you go to can have a lot in determining what grad program you get into, or what how they view your degree, the status that comes with that. It should.
I wonder how how prevalent that actually is, because kind of one of the things that our advisor has taught us has been that people only care about how long your CV is.
And I mean, it could really depend. And I think it would have a lot to do with the person who's reviewing you. I learned, I was actually part of a search committee and interviewed kind of for the first time. It's been really weird. And interviewed someone, and I was like, when we interviewed these three people, I went to the current faculty, and I was like, 2 years ago, if I were going up against any of these people, I don't think I would have gotten the job. Like, these people are great. Like, I like all of them. And the department head, basically said one of them did apply.
Oh,
when you went up, and it made me feel better. But I was like, why did you pick me?
You were upward social comparing to people who were applying for a position that you were evaluating for.
Right. Just, I mean, because again, like, I'm looking at like where I am or where I was in their position versus where they are now, and going like maybe I should have done more. But I'm like, wait, I was like, but I have a job. Like, I'm in the tenure track world. Like, wait a second, I don't have to. And that kind of gets us into, again, some of these labels. I think at some point we should talk a bit about like imposter syndrome. And maybe that's kind of good for where we're going with this idea of the labels that we have, because sometimes we do have to remind ourselves, like, wait, I'm there, or I have done it. Like, I have published papers, I have published a book, I have a tenure track position, I'm sitting in positions and on committees where people are taking what I have to say into consideration.
Man, you tricked that whole university.
and again, like, there's that feeling of like, why? I'm just me. Like, what's the deal here? But again, like, maybe like certain aspects of those labels, like I still see myself as a psychologist, I see myself as an academic, as a teacher, but maybe certain aspects or certain hierarchies of those labels have not quite sunk in yet. That
Mm-hmm.
wait a second, I could consider myself this, or I can add this label, or in some cases maybe I don't. I've had conversations where we've talked about we've talked with other faculty about one of my thoughts about being I'm on the faculty senate, and I'm on the executive committee of the faculty senate. And one of the things that always stuck with me, I had this teacher in undergrad who was going to become an educator in like elementary schools, and doing a school tour basically just said, no, I can't do this because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to be able to change anything at this level. And so she went back, she got a PhD in psychology, and she predominantly taught educational psych, child psych, adolescent psych to not just the psychology students, but also the education students.
Mm-hmm.
And her goal was that, like, if you want to change someone's understanding of, let's say, how kids view the world, you can't do it maybe teaching the 6-year-olds.
Right.
You need to teach the future educators. And I kind of took that to heart as this idea of, I can't change anything unless I'm getting unless I'm jumping into the system. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if I want to be able to talk policy and academic freedom and benefiting both students and faculty, I need to sit on these committees. I need to
Right.
take on some of these labels and some of these aspects of, getting into the middle of it, and seeing myself not just as a faculty member, but I don't want to say maybe like a quasi administrator. But there were faculty members I've talked to about this who are like, maybe you don't want to go in too far because it could change you. Like
Mm-hmm.
the labels that we take and how we view that. And
Yeah, it'll adjust the labels, and when you have to start compromising to work within that system, then the values start to change a little bit too.
right, that's the adage. You can't rebuild using the master's tools. It's a
Mm-hmm.
sort of famous paper amongst my English faculty colleagues. Um, but the idea, yeah, that if you're going to get in there, you're going to have to develop new tools and strategies, because if you just adapt using all the old stuff, you may never get out of all that old stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that, again, that gets into kind of how we view ourselves, how we compare, how we see ourselves cognitively within these social systems. When we become part of those systems, we kind of have this battle. Do we let these new labels override our old ones? Do we try to accommodate and adapt?
Mm-hmm.
Do we completely reject and just kind of
Mm-hmm.
try to do our own thing in the system as long as possible?
Mm-hmm. I
It,
mean,
it,
that works for a good number of people,
yeah, that's kind of a fake
as
it
long
till
as they
you
do
make
it
it.
well.
Right. And again, it gets us into, kind of the realm of the social self, of our self within these systems, within these groups, and how they're influenced. And we'll be getting into this a lot more in depth with things like conformity, group
Mm-hmm.
group identity, prejudice, are all tied into how we label ourselves in these, like with terror management theory, these cultural groups that we belong to.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that kind of comes up with this, and one of the ways in which the labels or the groups that we belong to, aspects of our self-identity being changed by the social systems we find ourselves in. So the conversion from student to teacher, undergrad to grad student to professor, or even things like, which will be interesting once you get into the fun world of, you know committee membership in academia, is the faculty and administration.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
mean, I've already dipped my toe a little bit in. I was the graduate representative for one of the committees. I don't remember it right now, but those are wild.
yeah, you have to
Those
like
are wild.
you kind of have to like politics to get involved in them, because it's very political. It's very
Mm-hmm.
it can be very intense, and there can be a lot of, though I did find, there were some faculty members I remember, like, I mean, almost to the point where, like, we're standing and talking to each other very intently, and then the next day it's just like, hey, how's it going? But there's also like a split there between like maybe the things that we're passionate about, but we're still having a civil conversation usually, versus even how like usually where the conflict is seen is less of maybe faculty on faculty, though that happens, but it's like the faculty and administration. And it's kind of interesting too to see current administration that were faculty having to kind of flip. We have a particular administrator who was in the faculty, and only very recently, I mean, to the point where he was on our union negotiating committee, and now he's on the other side of that.
Oh,
and it's kind of interesting to kind of like be in tune to some of the conversations that are going on, because it gets us into the realm of some of those labels, like stuff that he was maybe fighting for 2 or 3 years ago, he's now trying to negotiate against. And it's kind of interesting to see how that kind of shift might happen, and it kind of moves us into a little discussion on self-censorship. Because how much do you agree with versus how much are you saying, how much do you hold your tongue?
One of the, I think the best definition for self-censorship I found while I was prepping for this podcast was, quote, intentionally and voluntarily withholding information from others in absence of formal obstacles. And so it kind of taps into your political nature of the committee,
So it wouldn't include, let's say, an actual obstacle.
Right.
So like I've had
like a formal like, don't talk about this.
Or a good example of this is I've had a faculty member, one of my peers, mentors, basically tell me, look, if there's something controversial you want to say, let me know. You don't have tenure yet. We don't want to jeopardize that. I'll say it for you. And so I can have very frank conversations with them without maybe a fear that I'm going to offend someone who might be on my tenure committee in a couple of years.
Right.
And so that might be a form of actual censorship in that case, that there's this legitimate fear, this potential obstacle, perceived obstacle. That doesn't mean I haven't said some stuff in committee meetings.
Yeah, like I think the formal obstacle would probably qualify under a list of things that you don't talk about in your position on the committee versus a hypothetical list of things that may or may not offend and jeopardize you. So obviously you have to perceive a threat perceive a threat to the way that people view you and yourself in order for you to self-censor in the first place. So I don't know if I think I would qualify that as self-censorship.
Maybe a form. I mean, or in the way that like I lurk Reddit pretty extensively, probably more than I should. I'm on Twitter.
I mean, at least you're lurking.
But I lurk and I don't post, because even when I'm like, maybe I should, I'm like, no.
So I did find a study for Facebook specifically. This is Doss and Kramer, 2013. They found that 71% of Facebook users self-censor their posts. And so they write them out and then they delete them. And so they do it for their posts and statuses. They don't do it for comments. Comments work, that's a separate issue. But they found that people with more boundaries or people who exercise more control over their audience and their friend lists tend to self-censor more. Men censor more than women do, and they do it especially more if they're around other men or people within their group. But people who are around more diverse political and age variants in their Facebook page, so if you have lots of people from different ages and different political ideologies, then you're likely to censor the least amount, because from your perspective you are one of many voices. But if you only have like your church members on your Facebook, you're more likely to self-censor. Or if you only have faculty on your Facebook, or if you only have your family on Facebook.
Yeah, that's kind of my problem with Reddit is I use it for research. to contact communities and to engage with certain communities. So
yeah, you can't. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's so easy to figure out who I am. If I said anything to offend anyone, they could be like, "Oh, that guy works at this place." You know?
right. Yeah.
Yeah, like my Twitter handle. I mean, my @ is very different, but my Twitter handle is my name,
Mm-hmm.
and that I would argue probably causes a whole lot more self censorship.
Mm-hmm.
The Reddit, I find this really interesting. The Reddit analytics suggested, and this was a couple years ago, that only about 10, give or take some percent of Reddit users upvote or downvote.
Mm.
So that there's kind of a minority of, because they have millions of users, so this is still a lot
Right.
of people, but there's only a small percentage who actually do that, and then there's only like 10% of those people comment and post, and
Mm.
so that essentially what you end up with is this very limited
Yeah, it's like just a little.
community.
Yeah, it's a very small community with a lot of audience members.
And again, there are likely reasons. I mean, there's a lot of norms on Reddit about, you know, what you should and shouldn't do, what Redditors all agree and disagree with, and in reality, there may only be a small number of people
Mm-hmm.
doing that. Upvoting, commenting, downvoting, and they're probably very opinionated
Mm-hmm.
and very unwilling to self-censor. You know, maybe the
Mm-hmm.
difference is part of that person who's like, I don't care. You know, I've got this weird username. No one's going to be able to push back to me. I can get away with
Mm-hmm.
it. No one will ever know.
In the study that has the definition that I said, this is from Sharvit et al. 2018. This was done in Israel. And they found that when they did they actually created a measure of self-censorship, and they looked to see what kind of correlates there were. And all of the positive correlations with self-censorship within this specific Israeli Jewish context were right-wing authoritarianism, firmly entrenched narrative closure, so protecting your group's historical narrative, and blind patriotism, which, if we take it kind of out of the Jewish specific context here, we can kind of understand people who self-censor more as more entrenched within their group identity, and are more protective of those lines where their group ends and someone else begins. And so they don't tend to move beyond, and actually voice their opinions, whether they're dissenting or affirming. It is a way to kind of protect their own group identity.
And that kind of gets us into that split between like the self identity versus group identity, because we have a sense of who we are, and there is
Mm-hmm.
overlap. We have overlap. You can kind of take two, almost like a Venn diagram. It overlaps a little bit, and then eventually it becomes a full circle. And we could say that, you know, the person whose group identity overlaps almost extensively with their self identity, you know, may be more likely in those groups to be aware, like, oh, I shouldn't say that within this group, or that would offend my group, so or that
Mm-hmm.
could cause trouble in my group.
Mm-hmm.
Things that we can and cannot say, you know, amongst our family, you know, or our
Right.
colleagues, or in a classroom.
In our church.
Right. And so all of these different, you know, these aspects, and that's an important thing to note. You know, we'll get into this a lot more in a later chapter of things like group identity, social identity, but there is this overlap. Part of our self identity includes all of these groups that we belong
Mm-hmm.
to different degrees. You know, so I would say psychologist, it's a pretty big overlap for me. But also, if you broke that down, you know, social psychology is a much bigger overlap than,
Psychologist.
yes, or clinical psychology, which I'm not trained
Mm-hmm.
in. There's almost no overlap.
Mm-hmm.
Besides, I've got colleagues who are clinical psychologists. I respect the field so greatly. And not, you know, and I don't want to come across as sarcastic, like it's true, genuine respect. That,
But I don't have any overlap with those personality
but yeah,
psychologists.
I don't even want to say that, because I've taught some personality psychology. I've used personality measures. I mean, I might view personality as partially socially influenced.
Studying things that don't exist.
But we also see the same thing amongst like different groups of researchers where you went to school. And again, for some people, and that's what makes aspects of the self so individual. Like it's a socially influenced but individual constructed chart, whatever we want to call it, schema chart, and you know,
schema.
this
Schema's good.
Yeah, this self-constructed schema of who we are, but it's so individual to the person that how much do I identify as a University of New Orleans graduate in my undergrad? Maybe a little bit, but I've never donated to the Alumni Association.
Yeah.
You
mean you were on the football team?
No, I never went to any of the games. But also that'd be very different. That like the same thing for like a sports team that I'm interested in, or a fan community that I'm interested in. Like for everyone, there's going to be this different degree. It's not just yes or no. It's how much, how little, how distant, how engaged, how overlapping, and that it's something important to really take into account when we're talking about this aspect of the self is that it can be difficult to pin down because every person can be unique, even though we have these similarities about how the self is constructed and how the groups that we belong to influence our self construct. But it's going to be very different in how we respond to different things. It's, you know, you can insult the school that I went to and I'd be like, whatever. Yeah.
Right.
They might deserve it. Maybe they don't. But
it's not a threat to you.
It's not going to threaten me. It's not going to impact my self-esteem all that much. Now that might change if we're talking about maybe like the severity of the threat, the extremeness of the threat. You know, how defensive might I get? And sometimes you see that. I mean, there was that. We actually saw this as well, that I would argue that not a whole lot of people identify with NPR or Planned Parenthood, but when they were under threats of defunding, there was this increase in like private donations to both.
Right.
And that, so those, and again, like we're talking different hierarchies of identity, levels. So like, NPR itself, you might not identify with even if you listen to, but they might represent something that you stand for. Journalistic integrity, open, information, stuff like that. Or,
calm voices to soothe me while I'm driving through Dallas traffic.
Yeah, the car talk guys.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that suddenly, this thing that may not normally have an influence on you. And then again, it's kind of tied to those. We talked about terror management theory and self-censorship, that there might be this perceived aspect, and that I might still self-censor with that perception or experience terror with that perception, even if it isn't necessarily a reality. There's definitely stuff that I've maybe looked back on that I've said at a committee and I've gone, maybe I should have had someone say that for me. And then I a year later, it's not a big deal. I don't know. I'll find out when I go up for tenure.
Right. That cringe all over again.
It didn't seem to be a big deal, but I was perceiving at the time that it was. And that takes us to kind of our final, this long podcast, this final discussion of what I think is our chosen topic to tie all of this together. Cringe. How we cringe, how we experience cringe in others. And I will say, we're going to talk about this a little bit in relation to the cognitive, feeling, and social aspects of the self. There are people who have done videos and discourse on the nature of what is cringe and what is cringy far better than I think we'll ever do it justice.
Yeah, if you wanna know more, if this piques your interest, you should definitely watch the ContraPoints video about cringe.
And I'll have that as our official kind of YouTuber of the podcast, where we'll promote people far more popular than we will ever be.
Upward social comparison.
Right. Like we can only aspire to put together something as nice and as well thought out and well researched as some of the people that we're promoting. If we can just get a little bit of that, like we're on the right track, at least I would think. So this takes us to cringe in relation to the self, and I'll let you kind of introduce it, Thomas. And
Oh man, so cringe, I guess the most prominent form of cringe that at least, I feel like everybody fairly has a general idea. It can be separated out into many different aspects depending on if we're cringing at ourselves and if we're cringing at other people. But I think one of the things, kind of like as a self-defensive measure for our self-esteem, cringe kind of operates as a way to protect the self. So like we're talking about with your, was that comment okay or not in committee, for example, you will cringe at that later because you realize that, oh, social mess up. I maybe shouldn't have done that. And that's your little emotional lesson not to do something like that again in committee.
jokes I made in high school.
Jokes you made in high school, the way that you dressed in the 80s.
I was pretty young then. It's excusable.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, you're not that old.
I'm not that old.
For others who were willingly dressing themselves in the 80s.
I mean,
cringe.
to be honest, or the 90s, or the 90s, or the
or now. Really, if you wear clothes, you need to be cringing. I think that's the lesson here. And so the reason why we cringe, or it's been hypothesized, the reason why we cringe is that we kind of get a sense, we get removed from our own egocentric perspective on ourselves, where we, bolster our self-esteem, we ride hard into our cultural narratives, and we start to view ourselves from the perspective of other people, other faculty members, the students in your class, your friends, your family, yourself in the future, for example. And so you become acutely aware of whatever you did or whatever you're doing does not match how you're viewing yourself whatsoever. And so it causes you to cringe and realize that, oh, I messed up. I'm not being, don't want to say authentic, but I'm not acting in relation to the way that I view myself right now.
Yeah, so we could say, like, in those moments, there's almost a lack of self-awareness on our part.
Mm-hmm.
But suddenly, in retrospect, we become very self-aware of who we were.
Mm-hmm.
I have I guess, an example of someone like self-awareness example that always comes to mind, because when I think about this, I would argue this is a very cringeworthy event. Something that I witnessed, but was not necessarily, or was not the perpetrator.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So back in the yesteryear when I worked at Blockbuster Video, back when they existed, I had a guy get really upset with me, which was normal. I mean, customers get upset at your average retail worker all the time. But I remember as part of this, because I was really trying to help the guy, and he was getting really, really upset. But there was about halfway through this conversation where I'm trying to explain something to him, where the woman he was with kind of turned to him and said, honey, he's trying to help you. Like, just, it's okay. And there was this moment of like self-awareness where he was like, oh. But it helped to diffuse the situation. That suddenly that self-awareness in that moment kind of had him realize, okay, I don't have to be rude. This guy's willing to work with me. There was another time in which a coworker was being yelled at, and he lost it. He just yelled back at the guy, "Why are you yelling at me?" And it completely diffused the situation. I mean, you just get out of the store. He kicked the guy out afterwards, but that it kind of temporarily diffused the situation, because the guy who's yelling at him suddenly has to go, wait, why am I yelling at him?
Right. Yeah.
And we would think back on that event and go, this is probably not my proudest moment. Instead of rationalizing it as like that jerk shiftly deserved it.
Oh yeah, no, that is, there is a lot of learning that happens whenever you cringe at yourself. It's very visceral. I will never call myself Mary Poppins in an interview again.
But I mean, that's part of learning. I mean,
Yeah,
our
you mess
understanding of
up.
learning and cognition is we have to fail to
Mm-hmm.
learn, or to learn from that. And part of when we self cringe, um,
It.
or engage in these kind of cringy retrospective moments,
Mm-hmm. You definitely learn not to do that thing again.
and that again kind of gets us into that cognitive self, that
Mm-hmm.
it's the known versus the knower. It's that knower, that I stepping in and going, yes, I did this. I'm
Yeah.
coming to a certain level of awareness.
I'm the derp and I can't be the derp again. On the alternative end, with the social self, we also tend to cringe at other people. And so it's not so much that we're necessarily cringing directly at us, but we can also start cringing with people that we have things in common with that make us viscerally react in a cringy way to essentially punish them for representing us poorly. So you get into situations like we were saying earlier with like the Never Trump Republicans who are very much cringing at Donald Trump right now and putting out some aggressive ads to get him not reelected as kind of a, you're poorly representing our group, you need to go. And so
I was going to say that there is a potential, I guess, maybe healthy side of this, in that we maybe see someone else engaging with a level of a lack of self-awareness,
mhm,
or engaging in behavior that we recognize as, ooh, maybe we shouldn't do that. Oh, maybe this person shouldn't do it. It almost becomes, it kind of reminds me of a lot of like the research on like theory of mind, like our ability to put ourselves into someone else's shoes,
mhm,
or even in the same way of like, a lot of cringe stuff that's posted is physical. It's, we see someone
yeah,
hurt
so like
or
more of
mess
like a
up,
vicarious embarrassment kind of thing.
right? Yeah,
Hyper empathetic.
right, yeah, that there's this possible empathetic quality. I mean, in the same way we see someone like stub their toe or smash their
Mhm.
finger or get rejected, and we're like, "Ah, you really feel for that person." Like we experience this sort of similar emotional state, that there is that kind of vicariousness to it. But
Mhm.
it can go a step further if that becomes hatred, or like, oh, I see some of myself in this person, but maybe I wouldn't go that far. Maybe I should punish them because I don't
Mhm.
want to go that far.
You're making me uncomfortable by the way you're representing me, so I need to slap you on the wrist.
Right.
Mhm.
Kind of brings us back to that upward and downward social comparison as well. That
Mhm. Because
we're
we're way more vicious with that within our groups than we are necessarily with other groups, I would imagine.
there is the black sheep effect, where
Mhm.
group members who violate group norms or who do stuff outside of what we would view as normal for the group are
Mhm.
punished and ostracized because we don't want them associated. So if you're part of a fan community and you've got a community member who's engaging in this kind of cringy behavior, you want to ostracize them more because you don't want to be associated with them.
Right.
But it gets a little iffy when we're talking about something like the president, because they're beyond that. They're the exemplar, they're the prototype, they are the leader of the group.
Mhm.
And so when the leader of the party, so in the same way that, if you're a Democrat and Biden does something that you're like, it's a little uncomfortable to watch, um, you might feel the same. It can be difficult because this, like, if you're going to go and vote for this person, you have to kind of defend it.
Mhm. Oh yeah, no, you're forced with a choice. Do you still belong to the group? Or are you going to adjust to the new norms?
And so you start seeing these splits. There was during the second first second I can't remember, when Obama ran against Romney.
Mhm.
Second Obama
Second.
run,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
the first one
First
was
was him
Palin.
and McCain, or McCain and Palin.
McCain and Palin. Well, Palin was the star of that show.
Yeah. But yeah, there were Democrats for Romney. There were a
Mhm.
group who were very against ever voting for Obama. In the same way that there were likely Democrats against, Hillary, and there were Democrats against every Democrat, or Republicans against any Republican nominee. Yeah, you're left with a choice. But in those cases, like, they're still saying, like, no, my group is still Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
I'm just against this person. They're
Right.
not my leader. They're not representative of my party.
So that's another way that this cringe can work. So it can be empathetic when you're watching other people get hurt or let down or emotionally vulnerable. You can use it punitively as you see your self-image being tarnished by somebody else. You also see you tarnishing your self-image and cringing at that as well. And these are all very much visceral learning experiences that we go through. Like, oh, I watched somebody like tumble down a hill on their skateboard. I know not to get on my skateboard down that hill. I just saw this person embarrass the group with their cringy behavior, so I better not do that thing. Or past self did this and that did not represent me very well in that situation, so I'm not going to do that again. And so it's very much kind of these social barriers of like what learning about what is and is not appropriate behavior to align with this idealized self that you have. It's very functional, I guess. Very social, cognitively functional.
Yeah, I mean, we could argue that this, along with a lot of other things, so like why we hold schemas, is again very intently tied to it. It holds some adaptive function, some ability for us to learn, move forward, survive within our social spheres, or in some cases of like physical cringe, physical harm that we might see, to know, like, no, don't do that. Don't put myself into that situation. Be aware of this. But like with that, there's that extreme or that darker side, maybe not far extreme, but that ability for that to be kind of flipped or used in a more maladaptive way.
Right, where you're hurting other people that you could otherwise be benefiting from.
Yeah, and we could see some of that within like the fan communities that we research. Especially looking at, I'm looking over the last 8 years of anime fan data right now.
Yeah.
With that group for what the project that we're working on, and yeah, there are some subgenres of anime who are they just absolutely hate certain types of fans. You ask them like, what makes a bad fan, and they're like, this group, this particular anime, every fan of this anime is cringe. They're just awful, or they won't stop talking about things, they won't stop self-referencing, and arguably every fan self-references. Right. Every fan,
you just disagree with them,
argues. You're just kind of noticing like, oh, maybe that's a little annoying. And instead of maybe admitting that we do that sometimes, or we've done things, or I look at the example of me getting up, downward social comparison with my brother and his music tastes, forgetting some of the music I listened to growing up. When he's 4 years younger than I am. And so, there's that gap. I go back 4 years from when I was making that statement to him and go, yeah, there was some music I was listening to that maybe I don't want to admit to listening to now. And that instead of maybe learning from that and going, like, maybe I shouldn't be as hard on people for something that they're enjoying. I instead say, wait, no, I kind of see some of myself in there, and I don't want to be seen like that. So I'm going to point out that they're doing it so that it makes me look better.
Right. Yeah. And, the ironic thing is like, especially with our anime fans who are constantly infighting about who's the biggest self-referencing weeb, you look at someone who's not an anime fan and they're all self-referencing weebs.
Yeah, and
like,
again,
you're all like, it doesn't matter if you distance yourself from, say, Sword Art Online fandom, like, you're still going to be put in with Sword Art Online fandom.
That's
We'll
the one
call it
that
as we
kept
see
coming
it.
up. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, they're
But
hated.
but what's interesting about like groups like that is that again, if you can activate some of that self-awareness, sometimes you can start to, break people away from this need to be so vitriolic and mean to these groups
Mm-hmm.
that they're doing the same thing. The best story I like to tell about this, and I never pass up an opportunity to tell this, is that I was working with Dr. Edwards. He was doing some brony data at the time, and he was at this Comic-Con, general fan convention, I think in South Carolina, North Carolina. And he's there and he's handing out cards and he's saying, "Hey, we're looking for non-brony fans, non-My Little Pony fans to collect data with. Would you take our survey?" And this guy walks up and he takes the card and he looks and he goes, "Ah, the bronies. Hate those guys." And he starts talking about just how kind of cringeworthy they are as a fan community.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Edwards stops and looks at him and goes, "You're dressed like Sonic the Hedgehog." And the guy stops and has that self-awareness moment. He's like, "Oh." It's kind of like, I guess I am.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing with kind of the music snobbery. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess I was kind of like that. Maybe it's not so bad. Or maybe that some of the stuff that we're kind of viewing as cringe isn't really in that
Mm-hmm.
same kind of vicarious or learning aspect, isn't really cringe.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that maybe we don't like, or that, again, or we see ourselves in it.
Mm-hmm.
We see traits of what we could be or how we were, and instead of maybe taking that hit to our self-esteem and going, "Yeah, I was like that," or and then moving forward positively, we let that terror take control, that need to
Mm-hmm.
manage that terror take control, and we say, "No, I was never like that. Our group, our fan community's never like that. The people who are, they're not part of our community.
Right.
But all these other groups they're cringe. They're cringe
Yep.
worthy."
My thing is I avoid cringe by not getting too emotionally invested into the things that I consume. If I don't care about the things that I like, then I certainly don't care about the things other people like.
It's rule number one of doing fan research. As much as you can enjoy aspects of what you're researching. So if you're researching anime fans, you can love anime.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us who are researching the anime fan, we watch a decent amount of anime.
Yeah.
I don't know if we'd call ourselves like fans in the same way. Like our 1 to 7 identity scale isn't at like the 6 or 7 range.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
it's not 1. I'd probably put myself at maybe a 3 or 4 on anime.
I think distinguishing between fandom and fanship is helpful here.
Yeah.
So like fandom being my identity with other people who enjoy anime versus fanship being my enjoyment of anime. And like my fanship is super high, but my fandom is definitely at a 1.
Yeah, it's the self identity versus the group identity.
Mm-hmm.
And your fanship, like your friendship with the interest, is how I like to word it. Is yeah. So yeah, I would probably say, yeah, my identity with the anime community is probably a 1.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I don't really engage.
Not doing anything with other anime fans.
With the brony community, just because I have a lot of friends and I was a part of that community for a while because of friends and research and going to, I would say, it's definitely not a 1. It's probably also not a 7 because I'm not as, I guess, emotionally connected because, again, wanting to keep that certain level of detachment that I can enjoy something, but maybe it's best I don't become too attached to it because...
Yeah. I think that's like the furries for me. Like my fanship is definitely 0 or 1, I guess. I don't engage in furry art at all. But I've been to several conventions and I just love them as humans and as a group. And so that's probably a little bit higher, even though I don't share that interest with them. I just share the camaraderie.
Yeah, Pat used to call himself a brony booster. Is
Ooh.
that being a researcher, like in the community, especially because we were looking at a lot of stuff, and what we were finding was mostly positive. Not to say that there's not negative stuff. But that's also important too.
Yeah.
That having that balance means that you're willing to be like, yeah, there's some not so great stuff in that community, but let's talk about it.
I love them, but they're cringy.
There's a great quote that on a recent YouTube video on the Brony community, it was, yeah, it looks really cringy, but all fun things kind of are.
Right.
That music that you're really passionate about, to someone it's kind of cringy when you talk about it. But again, that comes into our definition of what that is. Is that really cringy? I mean, it's
probably not.
No, but it's a perception, and that's kind of going back to our self-understanding of what is and isn't something is in part perceptual. It is influenced by our social communities. And so what we define as cringy in a lot of cases has to do with the communities that we're engaged with. Especially if you're on Reddit browsing through cringe subreddits,
right?
Your definition of what is cringy is in part determined by what you're agreeing with, what's being posted.
Because I don't ever get on those, so my definition of cringy actually ends up being people who aren't fans of something. Like, if you don't have any interests, I'm like, oh, what's wrong with you? What do you do all day?
I will say that I have delved down those rabbit holes before, and some of the things that are posted, it does give me some faith, because some of those communities are very quick to point out, like, that's satirical. That's not really cringe. That's just someone enjoying something. Or someone from those communities going, look, normally, like, this isn't cringe, but like this in particular is really, really extreme within the community and is maybe a place we shouldn't go. And so, maybe. But even then, it's kind of hard to pin that down, but that kind of takes us back to our understanding of ourself and our groups, and our world is in part tied to kind of our experiences, and our experiences can greatly change what we view as cringe, as acceptable, as normal.
Well, I think I'm tapped out.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good stopping point. Maybe a nice little moral lesson to end on is to maybe don't judge people so harshly. We have to understand people. Worldview can shape a lot of things, and that's something we'll come back to kind of again and again, is how the social systems in which we're raised, and especially when we get into talking about things like prejudice and group conflict, whether the conflict is perceived, whether the hatred is perceived and then becomes reality, even though it maybe wasn't reality to start with. And I've got plenty of some references for that. So with that, that kind of takes us through the self. We will be covering next time. We'll be moving into what's chapter 4? It's chapter 4.
Yeah, chapter 4, where everything is.
Everything is attitudes, advertising, propaganda, and cognitive dissonance theory. I get to say my favorite line in all of social psych history.
Huzzah! I look forward to it.
Save that for next time. So with that, this has been another episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast, and have a good one.
Talk to y'all later.